the type of world in which our ancestors lived for hundreds of thousands of years. Women probably have 4 to 6 children in a lifetime. Half those children would die before they could reproduce. So the only thing we can be sure about in human population studies is that for the last 100,000 years, people on average had 2 children to succeed them, or there would have been a population explosion 1,000 years ago.
In just the last nanosecond of human history, which began 10,000 years ago with the advent of agriculture, we began to change the way we looked at the earth, something that we separated ourselves from. It is the basis for our civilization today.
We've spread notions of proper sanitation as we've vaccinated for diseases, as we've provided famine relief and basic levels of health care. We see an unintended consequence of our best intentions.
By adding fossil fuels to our agriculture, we have allowed the population to simply skyrocket.
Almost 100 million babies will come into the world this year. The rate increases. More babies mean finally still more babies. When these have reached the age of 40, the world will have doubled its numbers. Helpless, harmless infants.
In the 1960s, population was growing at an unprecedented rate, the highest in human history, as famine developed in South Asia, spreading fear to the rest of the planet.
These are harsh words. They serve to describe the coming crisis in population and food supply that's aptly called the population explosion.
I started talking about the population issue because it hadn't been discussed. People had not made the connection between what was happening to the environment and the fact that our population was growing like a skyrocket. And that's where the population bomb came from. Ann and I wrote it in about 5 weeks of evenings. It was a political track, basically.
The world started grasping the urgency of the situation. Advocacy groups such as Zero Population Growth emerged in the U.S. in the 1960s. For the first time, population growth was linked as a major factor responsible for the global environmental crisis at the first Earth Day in 1970.
What would you say would be?
Probably the burning of fossil fuels, right?
Probably cars, I would imagine.
Meat.
Meat? Working with the garbage, it's like that's the main thing, in my opinion.
Oh, people.
Oh,
the
people.
number of people. Number of people. Okay, that's true. Who are consuming.
That's true. We're growing.
Yeah.
40 years later, the environmental message has not changed. But apart from a few persistent groups, population growth is barely being mentioned. It's as if the issue has been diluted among all others. even though population growth and human consumption are the major factors in our ongoing environmental crisis.
How many people were on the planet for the first Earth Day?
About 1 billion.
Yeah. Maybe over 1 billion? Yeah. What do you think the population of the planet is today?
More.
A lot more. It was 3.7 billion in 1970, and now it's 6.8 billion. Yeah.
The problem is not that we haven't had an environmental movement, and that not that some effective things haven't been done. It's a big cultural change, but not fast enough.
Since the first Earth Day, we've had a 5-fold increase in recycling, yet we're producing more trash than we did in 1970.
And this is pretty well agreed upon today by conservation biologists and ecologists, people who study this. As we spread out, we disrupt habitat. Whether we destroy it or simply disrupt it, it is eliminating species now at rates unheard of since the 5th mass extinction, and that was the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. The distinguishing characteristic of this mass extinction event we're seeing is that it is the only one caused by one species, and we're it.
The human species is quite unique in the sense that our consumption pattern is not just given by our appetite. An elephant has a similar consumption pattern no matter what. But people, they can decide not only how to eat, but also how big their houses are and how much else they consume, how many clothes they have, etc. So there's no inherent limit to consumption for an individual. We have a compound problem of rapidly growing populations at the same time as our demand for resources is increasing, but the size of the planet is not. Now we are at global overshoot. Our demand is larger than what nature can regenerate.
And there's no need to think about anything like limits because we've never had to encounter them. We see ourselves as this tiny pimple on a pumpkin or something.
Our world population dynamic today is much different than in 1970. Although it is growing at a much lower rate, it is more than ever at the center of our global crisis. We are adding about 50 million new middle class each year, modeling their consumption habits from the unsustainable lifestyle of the developed world. A triumph for progress and poverty, but a ticking bomb for our civilization. The world is already giving us warnings and clues about the looming global crises that we can't afford to ignore.
Agriculture has always been susceptible to supply-side shocks caused by climatic conditions. We're seeing a different situation now. The demand for agricultural crops is on a strong upward trend.
What we're seeing in the world today is the demand for food now driven by 3 forces. One is population growth. The second is rising affluence, 2 or 3 billion people trying to move up the food chain, consuming more grain-intensive livestock products, and the conversion of grain into fuel for cars. The grain required to fill a 25-gallon SUV tank with ethanol would feed 1 person for a year.
Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1972 for bringing about the Green Revolution, he saw the Green Revolution as a way of buying maybe 30 years in order to